Jim, welcome.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Cheers. Nice to meet you all.
We're so lucky to have Jim here with us. I met Jim two years ago, was it?
Yeah, yeah.
2019, wasn't it? We went to the conference at Bath. Were you organising that conference or just part of the committee
No,
generally?
that was organised by Rob and Guy. I was
Yeah,
just part of the association's committee at the time. Yeah.
brilliant. So I gave my talk on EEG, of course. All of you know that that's what I'd be talking about. And what happens, during trance. And Jim thought it was quite interesting.
Very much
So,
so. Yeah.
so we got talking, and I went and talked to his group as well, and got to learn a lot more about what Jim does, which is quite different to what we do. Jim, perhaps I'll hand over to you and you can explain a little of who you are and what you do. If we can do questions, please, into the chat box, just because there's a few of us here, and I'll keep an eye on that and we'll be asking Jim questions as we go through. So, Jim, if you'd like to.
Okay. Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, really nice to meet you all. Thanks so much for inviting me here. I feel very privileged to be asked. Um, I work for an organisation called Goleudy, which is Welsh for Lighthouse, and I guess, we have a clear purpose, which is essentially to help people who are actually homeless, or to prevent people who are threatened with homeless from becoming so. And I think that the aspirational side of the work, that I suppose that those two activities are largely very pragmatic in nature, but I suppose that, having worked in the field for a very long time, what interests me and really drives me to keep working in it is that um, if one's not very careful, you never really fix the problem. You're forever just perpetuating it by allowing people to cycle through services like the ones we run, despite your best efforts. And I think that I'm not saying we achieve it, but certainly our aspiration is to provide sort of a meaningful change for people. So I guess something that has meaning on their terms, in the context of their life. And so I became introduced to, or became aware of, solution focus in about 2005, I think. And I worked for a different organization at the time, but I ended up incorporating solution focused training and service delivery into the department that I ran at the time. And when I moved to Goleudy 11 years ago, I was fairly determined that it would play a big part in our activities to try and help people co-create the life that they wanted, and invite them to talk about aspiration rather than just simply fixing proximate and immediate problems that were right in front of them. Sometimes that's possible and sometimes it isn't. The actual services we provide, again, just to give you the facts, I guess, is that we work across the Southwest Wales region, for those of you who know the area. So Bridgend, which I guess if you think of South Wales as divided into quadrants, is kind of in the middle of South Wales, through to the west corner, Pembrokeshire. And we run a very wide variety of services. So that might include Housing First project, which is the kind of modern idiom of homeless solutions. We run old school hostels. We own and rent community houses to people on a shared housing basis. We have specialist projects rather, for people who have addiction difficulties. We have drop-in services for people who can't get help from the local authority. We actually run we've been doing a couple of years now. We do a community fridge and are developing a community food as part of an emerging anti-poverty strategy that we're trying to deliver. At the moment, we're particularly interested in the link between the decline in people's mental health and food insecurity and food poverty. Since we've run our community fridge, we've kept about 27 tons of would-be waste food that would have otherwise gone to landfill into the bellies of people who have a pretty tough life. We can see sort of upward of 2,000 people a year. Some of those we house 24/7, and they stay with us for a decade, something like that. Some people might drop into one of our services and have a 10-minute consultation, and maybe that's all they need. We have, I guess, our size and scope is that we receive, I mean, I think of all the money we get as public money. It's either government contracts, government grants, or generous donations of bodies. So I think of it all as public money. We receive about circa £3 million of public money a year. I mean, that's all a matter of public record. In our staff plan, we have between 90 and 100 posts. That changes because our activities change according to need, according to funding. And I suppose, like most modern charities, we're fairly heavily scrutinised. So our activities are, some are statutory regulated, but we have multiple obligations to multiple stakeholders for the work we do. Where solution focus fits is, am I saying too much, Rachel? Would you like me to give people a chance to breathe there, or should I carry on?
Well, I think it's really interesting to know the background of the work that you do and where you're coming from, because each of us works in quite a different environment to that. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to hear how your work uses a solution-focused approach in probably what might seem to most of us a much more challenging environment than perhaps the one that we're used to.
Okay. So I guess we do a few things with solution focus. So one of the first people to train me, and when I did my diploma at Brief, was Guy Shannon, and his first book, he distinguishes between kind of the way perhaps he used solution focus in social work as kind of by stealth, and he distinguished that between the sort of one-to-one structured work. And so after I'd worked with him for a while and he trained a lot of my staff in the early days, I kind of thought this was a very useful way to frame how we thought about it. So what we did was we cultivated training programs to equip frontline staff with solution-focused practice skills that we then encourage and invite and support them to use in the ordinary everyday support conversations that they have with our clients. So I really try and encourage people to, they sit down for the first meeting and it gets littered with all this kind of language that's unhelpful, assessment and all this. And I just think, okay, so unless you understand what the person wants from our service, how on earth do you propose to draw up a support plan and work with them? So we encourage people from the off to try and use solution-focused language and questions to sort of find out what the client wants and how they know they were on track for that. And we thought, well, this is, we listened to the feedback, and long story short, staff found it was okay to use in this way, but they found it really difficult to sustain an hour's work. They found that when clients didn't give the answer they expected from a training course, they weren't quite sure what to do, and they found it pretty challenging. And they said, so what we'd like is sort of specialists that we could refer into. So in 2018, we got some funding from the local authority in Swansea, and we put some of our reserves into a project where we we employed a dedicated solution-focused practitioner, and this was available to all of our clients, and this was going great guns. It was really successful. Probably the sob story is that the pandemic hit very hard both the service in terms of ability to go and visit clients, obviously, but also the circumstances of the practitioner changed in such a way that he was no longer able to continue in the role because of his family circumstance, and this was something none of us wanted, none of us planned for. So since then, we've always had a pretty long-standing partnership with, I'm sure some of you might know, the Psychological Therapists unit that are based in Liverpool, which is run by Steve Flatt, who took over from me as chair of the United Kingdom Association, and the person he works with, Susie Curtis. So in our partnership with them, we purchased from them some hours from their Let's Keep Talking service, which is a telephone service which has emerged out of the pandemic. And so we can offer this to all of our clients now, and that's how we're delivering the practical sort of side of one-to-one structured sessions for whatever length of time I guess works for the practitioner and everyone else.
Jim, can I ask you something?
Sorry.
Is your microphone rubbing on your face?
Oh, it might be. Sorry, am I making horrible noise?
It feels like it's picking up, I don't know, picking up a lot of noise.
Okay, I've got a fan on. I'll turn that off. That might be
maybe it's picking up that.
Okay, 2 seconds.
Right. So Jim mentioned there the UK ASFP. That's the UK Association for Solution Focused Practice. And they typically host the annual conference in the UK, which is where I met Jim. This year it's SF24. So that's the conference this year. So SF24 2021, if you Google it, it's a free to attend conference. And you just get your ticket through Eventbrite. It's a 24-hour conference, people speaking from different areas around the world, and their talks are recorded and put up on YouTube at some point afterwards, but can be worth having a look. So Jim, I wonder if I could ask you then, if you had, if you're working with a client who is really struggling and you're trying to find out what would work best for them, would you start perhaps like we might with kind of what are your best hopes and go from there? I mean, would it seem like what maybe to us a typical session in that you'd be asking the same questions, or would there be a difference to that?
So I think when we've when people who've as it were trained as practitioners do it, we've tried to follow what you would recognize, so sort of standard how you get taught to do it at Brief or one of the other major training agencies. So it would be really recognizable in that context. I think when it's done in the kind of stealth model, so a support frontline worker, they might begin with what are your best hopes, but as practitioners yourselves, you might sort of immediately from the first response, you might be thinking, okay, so that leads naturally to this question. And you might not see that in project because number one, there's confidence. People maybe don't get to use it quite as often. And I guess that I kind of tried to be flexible about it in the organization because some of the frontline workers are really mindful, that they're carrying out statutory funded duty. And so they're going to be they've got boxes to tick. So I guess what we try and encourage is that in the service of ticking those boxes, these questions and questions like this may be useful to you, or this way of thinking about what you're trying to do may be useful to you.
And what do you think? Do you think it makes a difference to be using, either the full conversation or at least some elements of solution-focused practice or thinking? Do you think it makes a difference with these customers?
Yeah, I mean that's the billion-dollar question. So
Mm.
we wanted to measure this. I mean, I think that one of the reasons that I was so taken with Rachel's presentation at the UK conference is because Rachel trades in the business of science and evidence, and this is my aspiration really. So I wanted for us to be able to demonstrate and talk about this, because the whole field of so we would be described by the world at large as, you know, supported housing, and the wellspring of money that Welsh Government provide for this is called Housing Support Grant, and it funds all of these kind of activities. And uh, the conversations that I wanted to have with Welsh Government were around being able to say with some authenticity, so the money you gave us did this and made this change. So we set about, so we've done a few things. So we measured, we used the Warwick and Edinburgh mental health wellbeing scale, the WEMWEBs or WebWEMs,
Yeah.
I always get it the wrong way around. And when we did that as a pilot with one particular project, and we did it with a sort of control group, and we tried to measure, it was quite ambitious. And the first problem we ran into was getting the data collected. So the pilot took about 6 months longer than we envisaged. And that initial study showed that the well-being measures, that that everybody made gains. And in the first instance, the people who'd had solution focus looked to have made marginally better gains. When we collected, or we sort of doubled or quadrupled the data pool, it sort of evened off, so that everybody tended to make the same gains. So we thought, okay, so what does that mean? We're just wasting our time. So then, again, brokered by Steve Flatt, who's the director of the Psychological Therapies Unit. He has an academic post at Liverpool University Management School, and he introduced me to Professor Pippa Hunter-Jones, who was kind enough to let Goleudy be part of a research project that they did, and we're still active in that. And the first piece of field research they did was much more qualitative, and they used this trajectory touchpoint tool, where they were looking at it from the point of view of like a customer journey for a business. So what they did was they looked at our kind of values and our espoused ethos, which unsurprisingly is riddled with solution focused language. You know, it's about the client being the best expert in their life, etc. And through the piece of field research, they kind of tested whether the client's experience was anything like what we said we were aspiring towards. And the kind of feedback that came from that first piece of research, so the papers, it's an MRes paper, it's published on our website if you really got a few hours to
Work your way through
lose, yeah.
it.
But it really showed us that somehow or other we were getting this effect that we wanted. It wasn't necessarily in the way that I would have thought you could engineer it. So it surprised me, because when we looked at the qualitative side, it was like it seemed to be riddled with difficulties. You know, data was hard to collect, staff weren't sure. No matter how much training we gave on how we wanted the data collected, we only seemed to make the problem worse. And yet, when we did this qualitative study, Liverpool University rather just finished the second exercise. So I guess that we're going to discuss with them in a couple of weeks' time how they got on with that. And I guess we just want to keep doing more of that, because I suppose when I started this, it wasn't that I was wedded to the idea of, I know solution focus works no matter what the evidence tells me. I guess what I wanted to do was thinking, so what is it that we do that actually works for these clients that we're constituted to help? And how can we do more of that? And if doing more of that in a solution focused way is helpful, well, great. And if there's a better way, I'm all ears. I guess that again, we'll have to see what the data says. I think
Of course, we've all got buy-in, haven't we, to solution approaches. We all feel perhaps a natural affinity to it, or it feels as if it is the approach that is going to work best. A lot of people speak very convincingly around the solution-focused approach to therapy, even though it's fairly small fry compared to others like CBT, and other approaches. So
yeah,
a while till you get the data, I guess.
well, I've got to be fair. They turn things around pretty quickly. Essentially all of the difficulties we had with the pilot, as we were kind of getting those ironed out, the pandemic just made everything much more difficult, because although for me the WebWEMS is it's pretty straightforward. It's 14 questions or something. It's scaling questions. So even the most rudimentary solution-focused approach, it sort of leans itself. The questions are quite positive in nature in terms of they fit better with the solution-focused approach. But the difference in people doing that via phone rather than seeing people in person really hit our numbers. So it's what I think the hard lesson for me is that the business of kind of social sciences, I'm glad I didn't make that my career, because it looks much more difficult.
It is really hard, and all of us, I think everybody here is self-employed, so we've also had the struggle of to kind of working online virtually with the phone. Whatever the client can use can work. And then to add research elements to it, so data collection to that, is an extra challenge. But everybody's wondering what the WebWEMS is, or the WebWEM, that one.
Yeah, I've probably pronounced it wrong, as I often do. It showed that I'm not an academic in the slightest.
It's the Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale.
Yeah.
It's a standardized scale. It's actually WebWEMS, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it. WebWEM. Yeah.
Warwick, Edinburgh, mental. I'm typing it into the box. You can have a look. Wellbeing scale. It's commonly used tool in health and wellbeing research. It's very user friendly, so anybody completing it, the questions are easy to understand, easy to collect people's answers to it, and it's highly validated. It's a scale that's being validated, goodness, I don't know how many times. You pop that into Google Scholar and it will come up with thousands and thousands and thousands of results of research papers that have used this measure. It's very highly regarded as a measure of well-being and, of course, change in well-being, which is really what we're looking for, with this work. So that will be published at some point, or revealed at some point, will it, Jim?
Yeah. So I think I'm trying to think where it'd be now. I think we have published some of our quantitative findings, because I think that the first, the results of the pilot, I'm sure we've definitely put in the public domain. I'll find a link to where that is and let you have that, Rachel, because that kind of set us on the course, because we didn't see anything in that told us that this wasn't a good method to proceed with. We're very fortunate with our partnership with the folks in Liverpool, the Psychological Therapies Unit, because Susie Curtis, apart from being the sort of UK's lead on the accreditation system in the UK, she is an ex-statistician, so she crunches all the numbers for us and makes some sense. It's completely beyond my pay grade. So
no, you definitely need people for that, and I'd always rely on research students to do that kind of thing. good for their learning. Good for their learning to be able to do that kind of thing. Mike has an interesting question there, Mike. Would you like to ask that directly to Jim?
Sure. So, Jim, I guess that in your work on the front line, you must get some pretty angry and depressed clients at times. And I'm just wondering, do you get skeptical or cynical responses at times to the solutions-focused stuff that you're trying to do with them? And if you do, of course, the million-dollar question would be, how do you cope with them? Because I'm sure I would love to know how you cope if someone turns around and says, "Oh, I don't know, my life's so completely, but no, not interested."
It's a great question. I think there's lots of answers. I guess I'll try and give you a flavour. So I think this is one of the reasons why it's really tough for frontline staff who've maybe had 3 days. So our current, so pre-COVID, Susie Curtis and myself had a 2-day introductory course, and then we occasionally did follow-ups or workshops with people. I think the most training we've given standard project workers is about 6 days over 6 months. So it's probably pretty sparse in terms of dealing with exactly what you say does happen. I tried from day one in the job. I sort of thought, you see these programs about back to the shop floor and all this, and I thought, well, my way of kind of, I didn't want to be the chief exec who gets accused of being locked in an ivory tower. So we have a mental health day centre that, again, it had to, actually one of the few services we actually had to sort of suspend activity because of COVID. And this was people who were referred into this service. They different needs, but essentially you could find people who'd, spent years locked in a secure hospital and are on medication that reads like a chemistry lesson. And I had some pretty interesting responses to the questions that I asked. I think that, one person said, are you a doctor? And said, I've got loads of voices in my head. Can you fix me? I found that pretty challenging. And I just thought, God, I don't know how to deal with that. So I just thought I'd just be honest with him and tell him. So I said, no, I ask questions that you might actually find quite annoying, but it's proven to work with quite a lot of people. Do you want to give it a go? And he sort of said, well, give it a try and I'll let you know straight away if it annoys me.
Nothing like being put on the spot.
Yeah, I mean, he came back for 1 or 2 sessions, and so I sort of thought, well, it can't have been entirely useless. I think some of the staff is in the training. They sort of, this is a big topic. We've had to really modify. Susie and I have really tried to listen to what is tough for project workers, because this is the kind of thing they report. Is, they think, okay, I've got my training. I really love this approach. I'm all enthusiastic. I ask someone's best hopes. And, I think one person reported to me quite a long time ago now, but I often cite this example in training. So, that they asked, what are your best hopes, rather than what are your best hopes from this conversation? And the person answered, I want to be the best drug dealer in South Carmarthenshire. And they sort of said that just completely floored them, and then didn't know what to do. So they just sort of said, okay, I think that's enough for today, And, they often say, well, what would we do in situations like that? So, well,
you didn't ask them what one small step was that they could take.
I didn't, So we kind of tried to give people a few options about this, because I think one of the things is, I think you said, do we see clients who might get really angry? And an ex-colleague of mine that I did a lot of development, went to work with over the years. We were actually in the head office of a charity I used to work for, and the receptionist was terrified because I had an angry homeless client at the door, really, really demanding to see somebody, and nobody wanted to deal with this person. So we looked at each other, and he said, I'll go and deal with it, and I might, as we've just spent 2 hours talking about solution focus, I might sort of try some of your medicine. and he said he asked the person, he probably didn't ask them their best hopes, but he just said, what's going to be useful for us to talk about today, or something like that. And the guy calmed down instantly. And I think it was little stories like that that really gave me huge confidence in the approach with a client group that frighten people, or that people feel. So you get this massive disparity of responses, because as a charity, we're never going to attract funding like Guide Dogs for the Blind or deprived children. Some of our clients are, they're quite frightening if you don't get to know them as people. They they get bad press. So one day, Christmas time, the press can't do enough for homeless people, but then all the antisocial behaviour and crime you read about for the rest of the year is essentially demonising the client groups. It is complex. I think that sticking to the efficacy of the approach is helpful, or if you have to step outside of it. So I think we sort of say to staff, well, look, if you're stuck and someone asks for something, their best hopes are essentially illegal, is you just got to be straight with them and say, well, look, our agency can't be set up to help you break the law. In fact, we've got a drugs policy, and this is what you can do, this is what you can't. So what else can we talk about? How's this support service going to be any use to you, or what might be good at the end? It's very challenging, I guess, from my position to, you can only lead the horse to water, so to speak. So it's really an interesting problem to try and find out, how these conversations actually pan out on the front line. It's much easier with the one-to-one practitioners or the Let's Keep Talking service, because that it's all very clear. You can find out how that's gone. Pretty in the sort of stealth mode, as it were. It's challenging, and which is why we tried the measures. I think that as we get out of the restrictions of the pandemic, I'm hoping we can kind of kickstart some of those things again, and get back to where we were 18 months ago, whatever.
Do you have a referral system in place? If somebody comes to you and they do need a different type of support, do you have that available to you?
So each of the services we run will have a different type of referral to them. Typically tenancy support. So this is where people have a home and something is putting that tenancy at risk, whether it's they don't pay their rent, or they've got other distractions, or whatever it is, and we get called in to provide support to help them stay in that home. And then, if as part of the introduction to that service, we ask support workers to make the client aware of the options that we've got. And one of those things is our solution focus service, and there's our community fridge and other things. So we try and work out, so what it is they want, what it is they need. And then now we're using Let's Keep Talking. We've got a single point of referral, and one of our staff coordinates it all. They pick up a lot of the mechanics of that as well, which is really helpful. So Susie coordinates all the volunteers. I think, again, all her volunteers are, I think the aspiration is that they would work towards UKSFP accreditation. So they're working to a model that, I suppose, the model that the National Association's accreditation system is, I guess, something that we all feel we could sign up to. So we're all on the same page. I know that there are variances in the approach, and I'm not evangelical about any one or the other. I just like the clarity of, okay, so that's how a group of people who know what they're talking about designed it, and that if our staff could do that, or even two of them could do that, that would be tip top.
UKSFP accreditation is something that you might want to work towards. you know, those of you who've taken additional training, say like with brief, you know, that will prepare you very well for accreditation. It's a different body to something like the Association for Solution Focused Hypnotherapy, or NCH. A lot of solution focused practitioners don't use hypnosis. So, you know, when you start looking at these different organizations, you'll be meeting people who use the conversation only, if you like, in their sessions. And so if you want to improve your conversation and conversational skills, there are other courses that you can do. You're not part of that anymore, the accreditation process, Jim?
No,
I thought we had a contact there.
well,
Thought, you know, we could like, yeah, come on, Jim, get us in.
No, I did my accreditation, I think, in 2018. It's a really good process to go through because, and I've always been open with people that I didn't pass it the first time because the bar's quite high. But the solution focused community is basically the most generous and warm community, and the feedback and encouragement I got from not just the formal channels but the informal ones was just spectacular, really. And yeah, that really encouraged me to sort of like want to buckle down and do it. I think the group who develop and run the accreditation service now, it just gets better and better. There's some real smart people as part of that, and yeah, I think I mean, it is great. I think that, you know, brief have been really supportive and helpful. I know that they've kind of wanted to make sure that courses and stuff they run help people to get ready for accreditation. I think there's been lots of conversation with international bodies, so Harry Corman in Sweden and the Swedish Association. I know Elliot's been talking about it. So I think that the solution focused community recognised there's a really, you know, useful conversation going on to try and establish, at least on the SF conversation side, you know, what's useful for people and what might look like really good stuff and be really useful to people. Yeah. Sorry, rambling a bit.
Oh no, that's all right. That's all right, Jim. I just thought we might all get a free pass. You know?
Oh, if only.
Gotta use our contacts, right? Has anybody got any sort of questions for Jim? Kind of learning about how he works in quite a different environment. I'm quite interested in the stealth approach. What do you mean by that, Jim?
So I think, you know, Guy in his book and in our conversations together, he talked about, you know, when you're a social worker and, you know, sometimes you're a pretty unwelcome visitor to the home. And so, you know, this is definitely not a context where the people you're visiting have signed up for some kind of therapeutic intervention. So if you begin with what are your best hopes, or how do you feel about that kind of opener, you'll have the door slammed in your face, really. So I think that we tried to encourage staff to just you know, kind of pay attention to what the client's saying and sort of think, well, okay, so you've heard lots of questions in the training. You don't have to try and use them all or pull it together to do an accreditable structured session. But you might sort of think, well, you know, there's some questions that are just really, really great at kind of helping to turn a conversation. So I think one that we got reported back that people said was really useful was that when people are saying, you know, so you say, so how have you been since our last conversation together? And they say, awful, things couldn't be worse. Is to use some of those things like, oh, you know, how did you cope with that? Or, you know, so what might you have noticed that actually did work in amongst all of that stuff? Or what did you notice yourself doing? And the one where as you say, I think as Mike asked the question, when you even start the session and you say, what are your best hopes? It's like, I haven't got any, and this kind of response. And, that getting to the place where you can ask, so if that wasn't happening, what would you like to be happening instead? And to kind of try and turn the whole thing round. Staff rather found those kind of things that they could slip into a conversation that didn't sound like they were reading from a script or a textbook.
Yeah. I think that's the challenge, isn't it? Because in training, you kind of practice your questions and the person you're practicing on is very generous because they're trying to learn the questions too, and they answer brilliantly, of course, because they know what you're trying to do. And then you talk to real people. It's never as easy, is it? It's never as easy. And something we've talked about in supervision is around kind of, do you have to follow a linear process? Do you have to ask all the questions in the right order? Can you island hop? Can you hop around with the different questions? And I think that's part of this work when you are stepping outside of perhaps your comfort zone, is that it's not going to work in the way that you thought it might. That actually, it might be different and you may not get to ask all your questions, and that doesn't mean it's been a bad session.
Absolutely, yeah. No.
Mike, yeah.
I was actually gonna say that I guess that sometimes the truth is that the only thing that you can do for 10 minutes is actually to listen, because that's the best thing that you can do.
I mean, I think that is really true. I think that there's a phenomena in our work where when you ask questions that a client experiences kind of like prying, so if you've got a clipboard and you start saying, so where did you live before that and all this is really hated because they've probably gone through 30 agencies who've done this to them. And I think that there's something profoundly different about saying, what are your best hopes from us working together? And maybe they talk about how difficult things are for them and you don't interrupt them. And I think that in Liverpool, Chloe was the researcher. I think one of the things that she picked out was that the comments from clients about feeling like you weren't just a widget being processed by a bod with a clipboard, but you were being really listened to. And I think it's just agree.
I don't know if that's. Are you back? I think what's also interesting for those of us who have trained in and worked in the medical environment and kind of thinking about that, a lot of our clients or customers come to us with a history. We're just the next person they're talking to, not the first person. And I think what Jim's saying there as well is really important, and that we allow people to kind of bring us up to speed, that it's okay for them to share their story and to share their experiences, because often people come to us having had to prove that they need help, Of course, we know that we don't have to have them prove that they need our help. We're willing to just help. But I think it is interesting, isn't it, when people come with that kind of baggage, that we listen.
Sorry, Rachel. I think my my internet totally died for a minute, and I got.
I know it was you this time, not me.
Yeah, sorry about that.
It's all right. No, I was just saying about parallels with some of our work. Some of us here have trained in kind of medical hypnotherapy and the kind of extra techniques with that, and a lot of clients come to us having had to prove that they need us. So they've got this list of GPs, consultants, nurses, visits, test results, you know, all of this stuff. Look, I can prove to you that I'm ill, you know. And although we know that if somebody says to us, I'd like your help, then we're ready to give it, we still give them that time to just talk through their journey, if you like, to getting to us.
It's interesting, isn't it? As soon as you, because in a bizarre way, I think that some of the public policy decisions and the legislative decisions around homelessness put that kind of burden on people that they have to prove that they're legitimately homeless. I once read this ludicrous paper that was around the criteria that people needed to prove they needed a service, and it made me quite angry, because I just said, well, quite honestly, if your life is so bad that you have to pretend that you need the help of a homeless service, I think you probably do need that help, and you should just get it. And yeah, I think that knocking that barrier down straight away by saying, tell us what you're comfortable with, and what we're interested in is how we can help you.
It's that kind of instant success almost. I accept that you need help. How can I help? You know, and we get that a lot. Yeah, you know, we get that quite a lot with chronic conditions where people have taken a long time to be diagnosed, for instance. You know, that by the time they see us, they're like, look, I am ill. Okay, you know, how can I help you? How can I help you? Mike has a rather interesting kind of slightly touching on the philosophical there, or political, actually. Let's go with the political bent there, Mike, for your question. I think Jim will like this.
I'm just really interested because, I mean, I don't know if it is so philosophical. To me, it's incredibly practical, because it happens to me a lot in sessions that I do with people. I find myself reaching a point where I'm actually ending up saying to them, well, actually, you know, one of the things that we have to take into consideration in this process is that there are things happening in your environment you can't control, and they are actually really genuinely oppressive. Right? And that can be through structural oppression of lots of different types. So I just wondered if you have that experience of actually needing to acknowledge sometimes to your clients, yeah, actually, it's a real mess. This shouldn't actually really be happening to you. If that's part of being able to have the discussion then about, given that those are the circumstances, what's the best that we can do?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that, you know, for people who join us who are not quite as enthusiastic about, you know, using solution focused tools with the clients, it's true that a lot of our work is that pragmatic. So PIP appeals, benefit claims, people rubbing up against the wrong end of the state, or being denied this or evicted for that, is it's a big part of what we do. And I suppose that we work out, I guess there's two voices we pay attention to: the people who sometimes pay and refer the client. So they might say, well, look, this person's in imminent danger of losing their tenancy, and when you go to see them, they say, well, they might tell you something slightly tangential. I suppose your job then is to think, okay, so what am I going to do practically here? And so you've got to help them keep the home. So I think that the project workers probably trying to pick my words carefully. There's probably a sense of they want to fight for the client. They want to fix things for them. There's a sense of pride about that. Certainly where people have been denied statutory rights or denied state benefits where they're clearly entitled. We've had they changed all these rules. It's all a bit beyond me, but this sort of disability allowance legs in a wheelchair be told that, like, because he had a wheelchair he was mobile, so therefore he wasn't entitled to any disability payments and this kind of thing. And staff really get riled by this, so they make it a proper mission to get this fixed. I think that that's something that, in a sense, when we try and conceptualize what we do in our work, people found it confusing when you try to meld it all into one. So what we talked about was there's a heavily practical side to our work, and we really embrace that, and we really do that. And sometimes you could repeatedly do that practical stuff. You could keep giving people a roof over their head and a meal, but actually the chances are you could see them in 10 years in services just like this and nothing's changed. So then it's like, so what else can we do to try and fundamentally help them to get the change they want? And I was very influenced by Johan Hari's books around addiction and mental health. And I sort of thought, okay, so one of his kind of conclusions, I guess, out of both of his books was around the, like, meaningful connections in people's lives. And our staff got quite struck by this, because we at one of our staff conferences we showed one of his TED talks, and people really galvanized with this, that like, actually, yeah, this resonates, that if we can make connections for people, whether it's social, whether it's electrical in terms of Facebook or whatever the hell it is, or but even our yeah, the even with all solution focus, the community aspect of the work seems to be what people gravitate towards if they want to really change something. But certainly that external structural stuff, I suppose that, yeah, I think of it as practical rather than political, really. I just think, yeah, it's just an obstacle to be worked through. The client needs this, the state or agency or whoever it is, you know, there's a process in the way, so you have to find a way to work through that and just do the best you can.
Yeah. Any other questions for Jim tonight? I appreciate it. It's a very hot evening, and you know, there's a lot that's of interest here. Sue, yeah.
Jim, can I just ask Jim that you know, I was just thinking so much about. I remember years ago watching. I could never understand how, in a country years ago, you know, in a country where there's so many benefits given out, that there are people on the streets. And I recognise, obviously, that some people, it's much more complex than I ever realised or dreamt of, actually, when I watched a documentary years ago, in terms of how difficult it is, actually, once you get to that position, to get back. I know that recognise that you obviously need to, you know, address, don't you? You know, that's a critical aspect of trying to get back on board in terms of getting a lot of benefits. But I suppose there are people also you meet. What I'm thinking of is the fact that there are some people who, you know, they're going to be in a situation where they've got, you know, they are homeless. So because they are in that position, they have no a set address, etc. That they are now in a position where there are lots and lots of major obstacles. Is that the case, Jim? You know, I'm just thinking that some people might have almost become accustomed to that which is uncomfortable but familiar, and they just can't face, you know, the many obstacles they might have to surmount. But I mean, I assume that's where you guys come in. This is me speaking very much as a completely novice in terms of my understanding what's going on at the moment in society.
No, I mean, I think there's some great points in that. I think that, I mean, again, you know, the people we see are such a broad range, and they're all very different experiences, and they bring different stuff to the table. But I think that there are, I guess, social patterns. I think as a solution-focused person, I sometimes am horrified by the language of our sector, which tends to define people by their deficits. So we always talk about people with chaotic lifestyles and substance use problems and all this kind of thing. But I've done some solution focused work. I'm just reminded of a client who he'd become street homeless. He'd kind of lost what he had. I couldn't see that there was, this was my value judgment, but I didn't voice this in the session. But I couldn't see there was much wrong with this guy. I thought, he's lucid, he has good language skills, but his life circumstances had changed. He'd become homeless. And what transpired in the session, he'd got himself out of it and got into housing services by an incredible sort of force of will, because the gravitational pull was to fall into the kind of the street community that he'd established, because people want company. No one wants to be particularly isolated. Well, I've met a few people who do actually crave the most profound isolation, but this guy wanted to be with the community of people living rough, but it was like a magnetic pull into injecting drug use and crime and this kind of thing. He had the most, crikey, the resolve and resistance this bloke had. I just thought, I just don't think I've got that in me. It was just incredible. And I think that, so what I learned from that, I suppose, was how hard you kind of slip into that circumstance, that actually getting yourself back out of it and kind of even stopping it getting any worse is actually a pretty phenomenal skill. And so it then became like completely, I suppose the thinking you have around it is the compassion you feel for people where, it's just like it's gone so far for them. And actually, of course, they need services to get some semblance of their life back together.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wondered, in terms of, because of the obstacles that they face, and at the end of the day, gosh, especially in times like this, where people, it's so much easier to find oneself in a situation where, you're that much closer possibly to homelessness, if, you lose your business, etc., that you actually, goes, and so trying to actually instill that hope back in must be so difficult in certain situations.
No, I think it is. I think that the one thing that I think I suppose I don't know if I've achieved it, but I suppose a goal I have is to never think that I can imagine what it's like for a client, because I haven't had anything like the experience they've had. And I sort of think that it's quite interesting the kind of the little reminders we get about how empathy is not it's not a skill. It's we did a project review of one of our services, and we were chatting to a guy. He'd come from Glasgow, and he'd had a pretty rough time of it up there, and he'd been in prison and so on and so forth. And he came to Swansea, and he was I think he started out sleeping on the beach, and very quickly he got into trouble with the authorities and found himself back in jail. And he'd done whatever he had to do in jail, however long he'd had to be there, and he'd come out, and he'd found himself into this service where they call it the nuns, because it's run by nuns, and the condition is that you can have a bed and food, but I think you basically have to not drink and say your prayers. And we were just saying to him in this service review, like, would it have because his behavior and his thinking about his life had changed. The way he described himself in prison and the way he described himself since he got out was sort of like so chalk and cheese. So one of my colleagues said to him, so would it have helped you if we'd have come into the prison and done this work with you much earlier on than the work we've done since you've been in the nuns? And we were all thinking that at the time, this was a great question, and this was the received wisdom. The sooner you work with people, there's funding being thrown at going into prisons and stuff. And he just looked at him like we were crazy, and he just said, no, not at all. He said, I was in no fit state to think about this sort of thing when I was inside. He said, it was only when I got out that I realized. So all these assumptions we had about how tough it is for people, or what their life must be like, constant little reminders that yeah, I haven't got a clue really. I think that's why solution focus is so great for this line of work, because you have to almost discipline yourself to sort of work with people without any kind of judgment or preconceptions, and you just take what it is they say in the room. So I, again, uh, I hope this is relevant, but the amount of people who I've had a referral, certainly when I was more active in practicing with our clients, I've had a project worker say, oh, a client would like to see you. Okay, fine. Yeah, I don't know how you're going to get on with him, because like he's, been in an active substance use for 30 years or this, that, and the other. And you give all this stuff. And the danger is to slip into the idea that you can ask him his best hopes and he's going to say, I want to be clean or whatever. And his best hopes are nothing to do with drugs whatsoever. And you sort of think, I wish that person just not said a damn word to me, because it's just got in the way now. It's just like I've got to now actually actively push all that out of my head and just work with what he talks about. So it's I think if you do this work right, it should be, and I think it's genuinely very difficult, because we, like you said, it's very complex, and we can all, I've been in this line of work for 30 years, and I can talk about things that, find theories and all the things I've learned, but we could have a client turn up in one of our services tomorrow, and I could meet them, and it would be like day one all over again, because the idea that I've got some solution that I can offer this person from a template is pretty pointless, really.
I think you're absolutely right there, Jim. That we should never presume to understand or to know what the client has been through. And perhaps, I know I'm kind of using the medical example again there, when people come to us with this huge list of diagnoses and, all these different things, and I've been told I've got this and I've been told I've got that. What are your best hopes from us meeting today? What are your best hopes from us talking today? Because even if I've had what they've got, or I know someone who's got what they've got, it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. It's the person's individual experience. And I think Aisha says it really well when she's kind of like, remain curious. However long the day, the week, the years that you've been working, try and hold on to the curiosity. Be curious about your client. And I think
that's lovely. I think that's really lovely.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah, really nice. Yeah. I think one of the things that we modified quite recently, Susie and I adjusted our kind of messaging in training, was, I think over the years I'd sort of thought, if I look so enthusiastic about this approach that I look like an evangelist, and I look like I'm trying to sort of sell you membership to a cult or something, and I detected that any resistance came from this, and so we talked about we really laboured, I suppose, that these kind of things we're just now talking about, that our kind of assumptions for working with people, is we now, in the training course, it's not really teaching, but we discuss them then as these are assumptions for working with people that have been shown to work. It's not a belief system. You don't have to kind of go away and adopt this as a philosophy, or change anything else about your worldview. This is just, okay, so we've got to make some working assumptions about, building a door or whatever it is, and we're making these assumptions to do this piece of work. But I think that's is so important. I think that thing about, it's the most trotted out solution focused thing about the client being the best expert in their own life, but I think it's wonderful. I think it's just kind of like it's astonishing how often, it just works when you treat the client in that way.
I think also, Jim, it creates a different mindset, doesn't it, for them? Because I think it's actually them coming for help, but at the same time recognizing that they have within them, that there's a lot they can do within themselves in terms of they have that. You mentioned that chap earlier who had the most incredible attitude, amazing what he coped with and his determination, etc., etc. Made such a difference to his life. And I think it's that mindset, isn't it, that which for so long in a lot of people's lives, I suppose, is unhelpful in terms of helping them forward, because they see themselves as not being able to help themselves so often.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the messaging that people get when they've been pushed around different services is that they're without agency and they're treated like helpless beings. So it's no surprise if they behave like that in kind, really. So I guess we try to create a staff culture which is that. Yeah, and again, all this is we try. I'm not saying we guarantee it every time, because it's human beings, isn't it? But it's like, well, if we have to break that line, and I think staff really enjoy that about the work, because it's.
We lost you.
I think
We've lost him. You're back. Do you know, Jim, this has been so interesting. No, it's all right. We got you back. This has just been so interesting to hear about what you do, and it's so different to the work that most of us here do, and the people who I know will be, signing up for the recording after this. I'm aware of time. It's a beautiful evening. Jim and Mike, if you could both stay on, that would be fabulous. Mike, I think you can pause the recording now. That would be great.